Okay, good evening, students, colleagues, parents, alumni. Whether you're here in person or dialing in from around the globe, a very warm welcome to our KMSS Speaker Series. As you know, in this series we address topical issues of significance, and in this, our 50th year in Singapore, we're taking a special focus trying to broaden and deepen all the connections we have with our host partner country. Singapore does, of course, exist in a very particular context. A young, spectacularly successful country, it's sandwiched between much larger countries in a geopolitically complex neighborhood. That poses many challenges, and today we're delighted to welcome Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan to speak to some of these and take some questions. Educated at Raffles Institution, the University of Singapore and Columbia University, New York, Ambassador Kausikan joined the civil service in 1981, was appointed as Singapore's ambassador to Russia in 1994, with concurrent accreditation as ambassador to Finland. Multitasking, obviously. He went on to serve as Singapore's permanent rep to the United Nations, with concurrent accreditation as High Commissioner to Canada and ambassador to Mexico. Later on, he was Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, second permanent secretary and permanent secretary. He's currently chairing the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore and is a senior fellow at SMU. No more. Oh, I was going to say, such is the Wikipedia entry, obviously out of date. A little bit more digging, however, also says that Ambassador Kausikan has been awarded many awards for public service, including something that I initially thought was the Irish Medal of Honor, the Order of Bernardo O'Higgins, which turns out to be from Chile. So anyway, interesting. I confess that I hadn't also realized that there are many of such awards given out, and Bilahari has mentioned more than I will care to go through now. Perhaps as important, certainly for us today, Ambassador Kausikan knows the realities that underpin diplomacy, and certainly diplomacy when it fails. His father was serving in Indonesia when the Singapore embassy was sacked by a mob. He saw the aftermath of that and speaks of it as his first lesson in the realities of diplomacy and the nature of our neighborhood. This realism is part of his signature approach. He notes that as one of the last generation of Singaporeans who can remember a poor, dirty, disordered and unsafe Singapore, he knows what is at stake as a diplomat. He knows what can be lost, and he advocates for the direct approach in protecting it. Quote, "Diplomacy is not just about being nice or agreeable. It is about protecting and advancing the national interest, preferably by being nice and being agreeable, but if necessary, by other means. Small states have limited options, which are usually obvious, and the obvious options are not necessarily nice." So as you can see, Ambassador Kausikan is known for his candid views and his keen insights on international affairs. And unlike most Singaporean diplomats, he is known to mouth the occasional expletive, it has been said in the press before. Good. Perhaps most importantly, he tells it like he sees it. Perhaps even like it is. Let's see. And he does that even when there are consequences. In 2020, for example, his commentary on Beijing's handling of the coronavirus drew the ire of the Chinese embassy, who condemned his article as an attempt to smear and misinterpret China's politics and leadership. I think we have an interesting evening ahead, hearing his views on international diplomacy, and afterwards we'll be able to take some questions and have some candid to and fro questions and answers. So, enough from me. Please let me hand over Ambassador Kausikan.
Thank you for inviting me to talk to you. I hope having listened to me, you won't consider it an act of reckless folly. But I will try my best. I promise no expletives, but I will try to be direct and succinct, because I think you would much prefer that this be a dialogue rather than sit there and passively listen to a monologue from me. But I want to make some opening remarks to set the context for a dialogue. I'm going to order my opening remarks in three clusters. First, very briefly, some things about the nature of foreign policy and policy making itself. Some of you may know this, but perhaps some of the students online need to know this too. Those of you in the working world will certainly know this. And some of the more common misunderstandings about diplomacy and foreign policy. And then I want to talk a bit about two substantive issues, which are the contemporary issues, which are the war in Ukraine and U.S. China relations, including a bit about Taiwan. And by way of illustrating the first part. And finally, I want to talk to you a bit about the role of small states in international relations and in diplomacy. With your permission, I will continue along those lines. I think I don't need this. Look, the first thing that we tell new recruits to the Foreign Service, or at least I used to tell new recruits to the Foreign Service, is that there are no perfect solutions to international problems, and sometimes there are no solutions. So please don't waste your time and mind by looking for perfect solutions, because there are none. And if you think that you have found a perfect solution, you are probably wrong, and try to pursue it is going to cause much more trouble than otherwise would be necessary, absolutely necessary. All policy and foreign policy, more than any other policy domain, requires trade-offs. To do one thing means you do less of another thing, and there is no way and then there are some problems that can only be managed, they cannot be solved. And sometimes the process of managing a problem creates a different set of problems, which in turn have to be managed. And I used to tell my young recruits to the Foreign Service, you should not be discouraged by this because it guarantees at least permanent employment. Some of them got it, not all. Those who didn't get it didn't stay too long. The other point I want to make about diplomacy, and I don't think those of you in the working world will fall into this particular fallacy, but many still do. Because not many people pay too much attention to foreign policy, and there's no reason why you should, I mean, really, right? Unless you are professionally interested in one way or the other. It's not a movie. There are no good guys and there are no bad guys. And there are seldom very satisfying resolutions of problems, and certainly even more seldom, morally satisfying resolutions of problems. Secondly, this is not a sporting event where there must be a winner or a loser or a draw. Sometimes the outcome is indeterminate, and sometimes an indeterminate outcome is much better, more desirable than any clear-cut resolution, because a clear-cut resolution most certainly will cause another set of problems. And sometimes all you can do is to fudge over things and wait, because time solves a lot of things. I'll give you one example, and then I'll go to the second part. Some of you may know that on Christmas Day in 1979, Vietnam invaded and occupied Cambodia. And Singapore diplomats, in fact, ASEAN diplomats of my generation spent our formative years fighting against the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. The fight had many fronts, but one of it was fought out in the non-aligned movement, and there was fights over language, how you describe this, whether you condemn it or not, right? And there was one particular, I was a very young officer. I, in fact, just joined only for, a couple of years, actually, right? Less than a couple of years. And I was sent as part of the delegation to the non-aligned summit that was being held in New Delhi. India was then what you could call being part of the Soviet bloc, the loose Soviet bloc. It had a very interesting theory, which it didn't quite propound, but they certainly didn't object to, that the Soviet Union was the natural ally of the non-aligned movement. Now, if you are non-aligned, you don't have any natural allies, but never mind about that. Small technical detail. In other words, they're not a very sympathetic audience to us who are fighting against the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. And the The conference proceeded along very predictable paths. What I now know was a predictable path, but it was all new to me then. And the Soviet bloc and its sympathizers had one simple tactic. The simple tactic was to delay things and make decisions in the dead of the night on the early hours of the morning. On the assumption, which unfortunately was not an unfounded assumption, that the non-communists had less stamina and will be tempted by the dives and the bars and the discos of whatever city you were meeting in, and would soon disappear, and they would have the field to themselves. And that was by and large true, except that we had a small core of supporters, and we fought and fought and fought and fought. And sometime around 4:30 in the morning, I remember it clearly, the chairman of that particular committee, he was from an African country. I shan't name the country. I'll name it now. What the hell? He's dead long ago. It was Sierra Leone, right? Sierra Leone. And he said, no, this has gone on far enough, because they said something, we said something, they said something, we said something. He said, I am going to decide on a particular form of words. And he decided, and we in the Singapore delegation were all rather despondent, because we thought he had been unfair to us, and he had been sympathetic towards the Vietnamese. It was only 2 years later, when I had risen in rank a bit and was, number 2 in another delegation of a non-aligned meeting in a different capital, that we discovered that the Vietnamese thought that this chairman had been unfair to them and that his language was sympathetic to us. Then, of course, we started defending that form of words to the death. I tell you this to show that sometimes things are indeterminate and things are never what you think they are. And that's a characteristic of diplomacy. You have to make decisions with imperfect information, with information that is certainly incomplete, sometimes deceptive, but the imperative of doing something is always there. You can't wait until you have perfect information about everything before you take some action. And even not taking action has to be an action. In other words, you decide to do nothing. You don't do nothing because you're paralyzed by complexity or paralyzed by lack of information or something. Right? Now, that's the first part. Let me go to kind of 2 particular issues, the war in Ukraine and U.S. China relations. Now, before I go into that, one more general comment. I think unless you've been living on the dark side of the moon, it cannot have escaped you that the world is now in a more than usually uncertain state of affairs. And the primary cause of this more than usually uncertain state of affairs is great power competition, as illustrated by the war in Ukraine and U.S. China strategic competition. But I think we have to put this into perspective. I'll deal with these 2 issues in due course, but we put that into perspective. Those of you who study international relations or follow international relations may have noticed that a few years ago there was a whole rash of articles, both by journalists as well as academics, and some statements by people who ought to know better, in other words, practitioners, about the return of great power politics. And I was always very puzzled about it, because where the hell did it ever go away? Right? And I started thinking about it. Then I realized that we had gone through a very short and historically unusual period after the immediate end of the Cold War, from around 1989, when the Berlin Wall first came down, to about 2008, when the global financial crisis broke out. There seemed to be no great power competition because of the overwhelming dominance of the United States. 1989 was a significant year because in that year Tiananmen broke out. China had not yet taken off. It was laying low after the Tiananmen massacre. 1989, the Soviet Union, although we didn't know it then, had only 2 years to live. And when it collapsed, it was in a complete chaotic state. That was the time when I served in Russia. Completely chaotic state and no condition to do anything, for good or for evil. And so the overwhelming dominance of the US masks a fundamental reality about international relations. And that fundamental relations is that competition between sovereign states is inherent in the nature of international relations. Now we are back to a more historically normal period of world history. And I tell you this because I think there's a very important lesson to be drawn. People have short memories, and they've forgotten that we have gone through this period before, which in some ways was more dangerous than the contemporary period of great power competition. Because in many places, the Cold War was hot, right, for 40 years. Now, we collectively and we in Singapore successfully navigated that period of great power competition. And there is no particular reason why we should not successfully navigate this particular period, although in some ways it's more complicated. In other words, my lesson always to people is don't panic. We have seen this movie before, we've lived through it. We have survived, not only survived, we have prospered in it, and we can do it again, provided you keep your cool and let your brain work rather than be paralyzed by the complexity and uncertainty. Now, with that said, of course, there is a war going on in Ukraine, a very brutal war. But I want to point out something about this war. It's not unusual, you know. It's only unusual because it's being held in the heart of Europe. And to put things bluntly, white people are killing each other for a change. If you ask a Middle Easterner, if you ask an African, violence, interstate violence, intrastate violence has been a constant reality for him or her, right? With all the consequences. It's only because it's in Europe, and for once, white people are killing each other, that people pay more attention. Of course, the war in Ukraine has its own particular dangers because one of the participants is a nuclear-armed state, right? But violence is common. You ask any Middle Easterner, he's been living with it. You ask Africans, he's been living with it. And even in certain parts of Asia, they have been living with it for decades. And that's why I think while the West has been doing very well holding itself together, at least so far, I think they have been rather complacent about the global South, where the support for this war is rather tenuous at best. You live in Singapore, and Singapore has taken a strong and clear position on this for obvious reasons. As a small country, you can't take a big country invading another smaller country. Ukraine is by no means small, but it's smaller than Russia, lightly, right? So you have to take a strong position. But for most of the other ASEAN countries, most of Southeast Asia, this is a rather distant thing, a rather abstract idea. So they may support the war, they may understand the principle involved, but it's in a rather abstract and distant way. I think we should bear that in mind. Now, at this point of time, I cannot envisage any lasting political settlement. The political conditions for coming to a political compromise are just not there. President Zelensky of Ukraine has asked his people to make tremendous sacrifices, and they have responded heroically. How can he, under these circumstances, tell his own countrymen that we need to settle politically, and that will probably mean giving up 1/5 of our country? He'll be lynched from the nearest lamppost by his own people, not the Russians. On the other hand, Putin cannot admit defeat, because if he admits defeat, he has been defeated in all but name, but he cannot stop fighting, because if he admits defeat, what would he end up with? Even if Zelensky was prepared to relinquish 1/5 of Ukrainian territory, he will end up where he started in February when the war started. And after the immense losses, I mean, we don't know how much the losses are of men and material, but they are certainly great, right? How can he portray that as a victory? He has to keep on fighting. On the other hand, while the Ukrainians have done far better than anybody had imagined on the battlefield, I don't think they can push the Russians out of Crimea and Donbass. They don't have the capability. And if by some stroke of luck, they look like they might be able to do that, the United States will stop them by regulating the supply of weapons, because it is not in the United States' interest to push Putin into a corner where he feels more desperate. That's the hard reality. Ukraine is a serious and dangerous situation, but it is actually a second-order issue. The first-order issue is U.S. China strategic competition, and Ukraine is just the proverbial chicken that is killed to scare the monkey being China here. Right? Whether the monkey got the lesson or not is something we can discuss later, but that is the hard reality. In ours, the U.S. has really very little incentive to stop fighting, to impose a solution on Ukraine, to force Ukraine to accept a solution. Because I think it's just politically untenable given the state of U.S. domestic politics these days. So what is the outcome? The outcome is probably going to be a long, painful, grinding war that will go on for at least a couple more years. I hope I'm wrong, but the outcome will be a frozen conflict. The frozen conflict, I don't mean those relatively small wars that were fought in Georgia and between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I mean the Korean Peninsula. That's a frozen conflict. There is no peace settlement in Korea, and not one that is, none in any prospect. That conflict has been frozen by an armistice, not a peace settlement, an armistice for 70-odd years. And there's a divided country. Probably Ukraine will end up like that, I think. I hope I'm wrong, but that is what I think now. I mean, ask me next year, I may have a different answer because things are fluid, right? But it's going to be a long, grinding war, and frankly, time is not on the Ukrainian side for a very simple fact. There are more Russians than there are Ukrainians. So it's sooner or later there must be some kind of settlement, but it's going to be later rather than sooner, and it won't be a definitive settlement. It will be some form of armistice, because people will get exhausted. They can't go on fighting forever. Right? But that will mean that this is a frozen conflict that can be ignited at any moment. Mr. Putin's fundamental goal is the extinction of Ukraine, which he doesn't believe is a legitimate sovereign country. And I think a fair number of Russians would share that view. That's the hard fact. There are some that hope for regime change in Russia, but I always tell those people, don't think the alternative to Mr. Putin is better than Mr. Putin. Probability is it will be worse. Because the most serious criticism of the war within Russia are from the right, the people who say he is not persecuting the war with sufficient rigor. And if Mr. Putin is deposed, probably one of that crowd will take his place. So change is not always for the better, something to bear in mind. But as I said, this is a second-order issue. The main issue is U.S. China relations. This is a new structural reality of international relations, which is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. And for the foreseeable future, I don't mean 1 year or 2 years, I mean a decade or more, you know. When I say it's a structural feature, I mean it's one of the defining features of contemporary international relations, which we better learn to live with. There will be periods of high-intensity conflict, there will be a competition and low-intensity competition, but there will always be competition of a sort. From the time that the US and China re-established contacts in 1972 to around 2010, 11, 12, something around that, it's hard to put an end date, there were periods of competition and tension in US-China relations over Taiwan, over human rights issues like Tibet, over Tiananmen, which occurred during that period. But by and large, the overall emphasis of the relationship was on engagement. Now it's flipped. There will be periods of cooperation or lesser tension, but the overall emphasis is on competition. That's a new fact. Sometimes people describe this new situation as a new Cold War. I don't think that is an appropriate way of describing US-China competition. In fact, it fundamentally misrepresents the nature of that competition in ways that can be quite dangerous if you misunderstand it. Now, the competition between US and Soviet was fundamentally, US and the Soviet Union was fundamentally different. The US and the Soviet Union each led two separate systems that were connected only tangentially. And the Soviet Union was never a very important economic actor except sporadically on the energy market and so on. So the competition was between systems to see which would displace the other. But the US and China are both vital, irreplaceable components of one single system. And they are connected to each other and to the rest of us by a new phenomenon that grew up during that short and historically abnormal period between 1989 and circa 2008. And that new phenomenon are supply chains of a complexity, of a density, and of a scope never before seen in world history. And that's what distinguishes 21st century interdependence from earlier periods of interdependence, which have existed, of course. And I find it very, very, very difficult to believe that this web of dense, complex supply chains can bifurcate completely into two separate systems. There has already been partial bifurcation in specific domains, particularly in high technology areas, semiconductors of a certain kind, and so on, right? I mean, you know these things, I don't have to elaborate. But I don't think it can be completely separated into two separate systems at any cost that is acceptable to either of the two principles, let alone the rest of us. We are not important in this thing. So the competition between the US and China will largely be within a system. Neither is very comfortable with this. There are people in the US who talk still about decoupling, or at least reducing reliance on China in this web of supply chains. But this is all easier said than done, and even if it can be done, it will take a very long time. There are people in China who are uncomfortable with this, and therefore Mr. Xi Jinping has emphasized becoming more self-reliant in technologies, and also relying more on domestic consumption to drive growth. But that, again, is also easier said than done. And even if it can be done, it will take a very long time. So for the foreseeable future, they will compete within a single system. And competition within a system is fundamentally different from competition between systems. For a start, it's unlikely to end in any clear-cut outcome as the US-Soviet competition did. And that took 40 years or more, right? Because it's not about completely displacing one or the other of the principles. Both the US and the China may wish to dominate the single system or which they own parts, but it's not in their interest to destroy that system or to replace it with something else, because they will all lose. Secondly, it is not a binary competition. It's a much more complex form of competition, although the binary frame of mind still lingers on. It's a very powerful frame of mind because it's simple, right? And I'll give you one example of this more complex kind of competition. I think we all know that semiconductors, particularly at the higher ends, have emerged as a very serious Chinese vulnerability because the semiconductor supply chain is one of the most complex. And all its most vital nodes are held by the US or its friends and allies. And that is true whether you're talking about the fabricators, that's true whether you're talking about the producers of the machine tools that you need to make high-end chips. It's true whether you're talking about the chemicals you need, or the materials you need, or the kind of software that you need to design these things. And besides, I don't pretend to know all the ins and outs of the technology of producing semiconductors. My brain is wired differently. I don't have that particular semiconductor in my brain to understand it. But I try to understand it, and I talk to many people who know the industry very well. And they try to explain it to me this way. Why they don't think it is very likely that China can catch up at any acceptable cost. They said to me that probably Singapore can design and make one chip of the highest type. And therefore, if we can do it, China can do it. But one chip is useless. You have to make hundreds of millions, if not billions. And that's a completely different process, in which a very complicated process, which everything must fit perfectly, because you have to make hundreds of millions, or if not billions of chips at some kind of commercially sustainable cost. I mean, if money is no object, but money is always an object, then maybe they can do it, but they can't. Right? They have boasted now and then about making a breakthrough to making a thinner chip. I mean, they meaning China, but 1 or 2 chips is useless. Whether they can find the new processes to make hundreds of millions, that's another matter. So it's a very serious Chinese vulnerability. On the other hand, and particularly with the new legislation and the new administrative rules that the US put into place, they can strangle China's chip industry because basically you now need a license to do almost anything with China that involves chips. If you are doing something that somewhere has got some American intellectual property in it, you have to ask permission to get a license. And almost every damn thing has some American intellectual property in it, right? Because America is still well ahead in most of these domains. But, and this is a very big but, China is about 40% of the world semiconductor market. And you cannot possibly cut your own companies and those of your friends and allies off from 40% of a market without damaging them grievously. So it's not a binary competition. You have to sell certain things to China in your own interest. And I think on the same day this new legislation was enacted, or the new regulations were enacted, the Americans almost immediately granted 2 exemptions, one to a Korean company, South Korean company, and one to an American company to continue producing in China because what they were doing is not just for China, but for other people too. Right? So that's a more complex kind of competition. Now, I'm going to stop here. We can talk about both Ukraine and U.S. China. Oh, no, let me make a word about Taiwan. I said competition is a long-term structural feature of international relations, but competition is not conflict and does not necessarily become conflict. Some of you may have heard of the Thucydides trap, but that's a particularly silly theory by an otherwise intelligent professor of international relations, who is a friend of mine, by the way, and he knows I'm talking about him like this because I talk about him like this in front of him too. In fact, he was just in Singapore and I told him so again, yet again. And now he says it's all misunderstood. Okay, fine. I know. He's much my senior, so I don't want to contradict him too much. A little contradiction is good for his soul, but not too much. I don't think it's too mechanical a theory. Competition need not become conflict, and certainly there's nothing inevitable about it. US-Soviet competition, which in some ways was more dangerous, never became conflict, at least not between the 2 main principles. Why? For a very simple reason. Nuclear deterrence. It makes it much too dangerous. And that's why, for example, President Biden correctly has refused to declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine, although the Ukrainians and some other EU members asked him to do so. And that's why he has still so far not supplied long-range missiles and other kinds of long-range munitions to Ukrainians, because it's just too dangerous. He doesn't want to start World War III. Now that same dynamic of nuclear deterrence, mutually assured destruction, will, I think, keep the peace between the US and China as he kept the peace between US and the Soviet Union. And China is rapidly modernizing its nuclear forces to ensure this will be so. I don't find anything particularly unusual or sinister about China modernizing its nuclear forces. In fact, if you are a nuclear weapon state, you should do that so as to maintain credible second strike capability. It would be irresponsible not to do so. So it will keep the peace. So the risk really is not war by design between the US and the United States. War by design, I mean one side or the other, starting war as an instrument of policy, as Mr. Putin tried to do in the Ukraine but botched completely. We can talk about that more, but the consequences of that have been completely the opposite of what he expected, at least so far. Right? The risk is of accident getting out of hand for one reason or the other, and that risk is highest in the Taiwan Straits. Now, I don't think the risk of war by design over Taiwan is very high. I don't think either the US or China, despite its fierce rhetoric, is eager to go to war over Taiwan for a very simple reason. Both of them are not sure they can win. And therefore, they are not very eager to go to war. On the other hand, neither is going to renounce the use of force, either to reunify Taiwan or to defend Taiwan. So it is a kind of precarious situation. I don't think the risk is very high, but it is certainly higher today than it was, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago. But the risk is of an accident, and I think that risk has risen slightly. We can talk about that if you like, but the new factor is the recent local elections in Taiwan. But I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but we can talk about that later. So now the last point, how does a small country position itself in all this? I mean, the simplest answer is, of course, very, very, very carefully, right? But I will tell you what I have also spent several decades telling young recruits to the Singapore Foreign Service, which I am glad to report to you that is now quite internalized, although I'm no longer there. I still teach in the Diplomatic Academy. But I always tell them to start from this premise. As a small country, you are irrelevant. So your strategic imperative is every day you must wake up and think of how do I make myself relevant. Right? And that is a never-ending process. It's a never-ending process because what makes you relevant vis-a-vis country A today may be irrelevant to country B today, but also irrelevant to country A in a week or a month or a year. It's a constant process. It's a marathon with no end. So there is no magic formula in relevance. It's a long-distance marathon, not one in which there is a definite end to the race. It's a marathon with no end. But that is the existential condition of a small country. But the other factor which I also tell them is that no matter how small you are, no matter how dire the circumstances you may be in seem to be, you always have agency. And the more complex the situation, the greater the opportunity at least to exercise agency, because in complexity, there is maneuver space. Now, whether you have the brain to recognize the opportunity and the courage and agility to use it, those are different methods. But there is always agency, even for the smallest country, even in the most dire situations. Because if it were not so, I would not be standing here talking to you, nor would you be here, or nor would your children be in this very nice school. Because Singapore should not exist. Singapore exists because the circumstances we found ourselves on the 10th of August 1965, the day after we had independence thrust upon us, were far more dire than those that we are in now. And we had far less resources at our disposal. I do not mean only monetary resources, I mean military resources, I mean intellectual resources, I mean bureaucratic resources. Singapore was a very different place here then, but here we are. So there is always agency, and with that final thought, I will shut up now and take your questions. Thank you for listening to me. Shall we sit down?
Yep, let's sit down. So thank you, Ambassador Kausikan, for such a engaging talk. I mean, you set out the general picture as you see it, and you exemplified it through Ukraine, Taiwan, and the strategic competition. And you made a few remarks about Singapore. I know underneath many of your remarks, there's a sort of a realist approach of deal with the world the way it is. I wonder if it's worth us thinking about the alternative of idealism. Would a cynic say that nations only use principles as a fig leaf? Strong nations use it to hide raw power, and weak nations use it to hide their weakness and try and get leverage. At the end of the day, is it the case that it is just about being realistic in terms of power, and moral principles really have no place to play in international relations?
No, I don't think so, because that is often the case, but I think that's a gross simplification. Because even if you want to achieve something idealistic, or you want to achieve anything, you have start from the premise of taking the world as it is, not as you wish it to be, right? Because otherwise you will never get to where you want to be. So this idea that there is a difference between idealism and realism is a very simplistic idea. To try to advance your national interest is not, I think, an ignoble end. Of course, you don't have to define your national interest in a very narrow ways, and most countries don't, most of the time, right? You can define it in terms of support for international law or support for regional organizations like ASEAN, and that's also your national interest. Mind you, it's not only your interest, and some of these things are, ideals are simultaneously tools, as you alluded to, but they're also ends in themselves. There is a very silly debate in international relations theory about whether values or interests are more important, all right? But, values are an interest. It's not the only interest, but they are interests. You can't have a totally cynical foreign policy because people will ask what for. The end of any foreign policy is to ensure the survival, the prosperity of your country, but that need not be defined narrowly because Singapore's survival and prosperity depends certainly on the survival and prosperity of our neighbors and generally on a stable international system. And you do what you can to ensure that. Right? So I think this is a false dichotomy.
Yeah. Thank you. And what you said there was interesting because what you said was that as a small country, Singapore's interests depend on the interests of its neighbours. And does that suggest to you that there's also perhaps a false dichotomy between competition and cooperation?
No, they exist simultaneously. In the most fierce competition of the U.S. and Soviet Union, there was a common interest of cooperation, not to kill everybody on Earth, all right? At least that, at a minimal level. But there were more other things, right? And it's so in China. It's not very evident now because they are both in a rather excitable state of state and stage of their competition. But it is there nonetheless. I don't think either China nor the United States wants to, blow up the world, assuming they have the capability. China doesn't really have the capability yet, but it's rapidly acquiring it. So there is always this discord, collaboration, competition, cooperation. These are coexist simultaneously. That is what makes sometimes international relations hard to grasp. When I started by saying that this is not a sporting event that there's win, lose, or draw. That's kind of what I meant.
Yeah. So avoiding the binary mindset and recognizing the complexity.
Yeah.
I think we'll go to some questions. I know we've had lots coming in, and there are probably questions from the audience, and we've got Sinead will be sort of hosting that and maybe taking some either from the audience here or from online. Should we start with a couple here? I see some hands up.
You don't mind I stand up because when I sit down, the light glares into my eye and I see nothing. Right? And I like to see who I'm talking to. Right? Okay, that's nice. Thanks.
Thank you for your very insightful comments. I have a quick question.
Sure.
If hypothetically, if China was to enter a small uninhabited Taiwanese island, how would the Americans respond?
I haven't the slightest idea, actually. But I think they must respond in some way.
Sure.
Not necessarily a full-blown war, because it's not worth it, but not to respond would be to invite further encroachments, right? So they will have to do something. But what exactly they do, haven't a clue. Fortunately, I was only working for the Singapore Foreign Service, not the American Foreign Service. One of the advantages about small countries, you don't have to face this kind of problems. Okay? You can elude them as I just did your question.
Sure. Can I have a short follow-up question as well?
Sure.
Under what circumstances would China be tempted to enter the Taiwanese mainland uninvited?
Okay, you must invade.
Sure.
Yeah. You're more diplomatic than me. Enter uninvited. I must remember that phrase. Okay. No, I think China is not eager to fight because if he fights, he must win. Mr. Putin can probably survive this mess he has made of Ukraine, but there is no Chinese leader that can survive if he botches up an invasion of Taiwan. And even I think the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy will be seriously shaken, right? So if they fight, they must win, and they must probably win pretty quickly. Now, an amphibious operation is the most difficult kind of military operation to carry out. Those of you who are Singaporeans and serve national service will know this because even a minor sea hook, the only thing you can be sure of, something is bloody going to go wrong. right? Because it's a sea, after all, you can't control the damn sea, right? So I don't think they're eager. But there are two situations where even if they think they are going to lose, they must fight. Because no Chinese leader can survive not fighting under those two circumstances. One is if China revives its ambitions to acquire nuclear weapons. It had those ambitions in the 1970s, and they were beginning a nuclear weapon program with the help of Israel. But the Americans slapped down both Israel and Taiwan. But those ambitions have never gone away. They are still there. I know that, right? That is not a very likely scenario, right? But the second scenario where the Chinese must fight, if Taiwanese internal politics takes a turn where a Taiwanese leader comes to power that is reckless enough to declare independence unilaterally or push the boundary too incautiously that go over a red line that must exist, but nobody is quite sure where. Even the Chinese are not sure where the red line is. They all know there is a red line, but nobody knows where it is. That's the danger, all right? But of course, a unilateral declaration of independence is just too far. Now that, unfortunately, is not a totally implausible or unlikely scenario. And that's where I said the recent local elections in Taiwan may have made it slightly more probable. Now, local elections are local elections, all right? I mean, in Taiwan, they are really local. Sometimes the issues are very, very, very minor, and sometimes it's just personality. And generally speaking, whoever's the incumbent government doesn't do very well in local elections, whether the incumbent is the KMT or the DPP. That's the general dynamic. But there is one aspect of this local election that I think I at least find a little disturbing. Tsai Ing-wen is about as good a DPP leader as you're ever going to get. Now, is Tsai Ing-wen typical, or is the other DPP leader, Chen Shui-bian, more typical of the DPP? I rather fear it's Chen Shui-bian, not Tsai Ing-wen, right? Now, in this last election, about a couple of weeks ago, or less than a couple of weeks ago, all the candidates that were favored by Tsai Ing-wen lost, right? And that has raised the prospects of her vice president, William Lai Ching-te, somewhat. Now, William Lai is a person, and I don't mind saying it, I don't trust at all. He is not a very responsible man, but he's probably more typical of the DPP kind of leader than Tsai Ing-wen. And I don't trust him because I was recently in Japan, and I was told on very good authority by people who were there, he gate-crashed former Prime Minister Abe's funeral. It's the private family funeral. Now, what kind of character gate-crashes a funeral? Are you going to trust this kind of character? No, and that's just the latest thing he has done. So, insofar as his political prospects have slightly improved after the thing, I'm slightly more pessimistic about Taiwan. So these are the two conditions where even if they think they're going to lose, they've got to fight.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, somebody up there. Maybe the gentleman on the left, my left, and then you with the gentleman, well-dressed gentleman with the coat and tie.
Do you think it will be in the interest of the U.S. to enter a mutual defense pact with Taiwan to prevent conflicts from arising in the first place?
No. I tell you why. I have been watching Taiwan for a very long time. I think it's one of the worst kept military secrets that the Singapore Armed Forces trains in Taiwan. And I went there for military training first in 1977. And I went back regularly until I was 50 years old when my military obligations are over. And I've seen two trends in this quite long period of time. One, I have seen a degradation of the Taiwanese will to defend themselves. Well, for a variety of reasons, mainly due to their domestic politics, they have reduced their period of national service to 4 months. Now, 4 months is just about time to teach a soldier not to shoot himself in the foot. That does not seem to me to be a very strong indicator of a strong will to defend yourself. Right? And you ask American defense contractors, they're very happy to sell stuff to Taiwan, but the Taiwanese want to buy the wrong stuff or not enough of the right stuff. I can go into that later, but just take my word for it, right? So that's one trend. The will to defend themselves is declining. At the same time, their sense of entitlement is rising, right? The sense of entitlement is rising, then the logic is very simple. I'm such a nice democracy. And moreover, I'm the only Chinese democracy, therefore you must defend me. And these days, I'm such a nice Chinese democracy and I have semiconductors, therefore you must defend me. Now that is a very dangerous frame of mind when it feeds into Taiwanese domestic politics. And if you have a guarantee of being defended, it'll get worse. They will do very reckless things. Strategic ambiguity, which is the American policy, I hope it's still the American policy, has two aspects. One is what will America do? But connected to that, what is the status of Taiwan? And what will America do is meant to keep both the Chinese and the Taiwanese guessing so they will not get reckless. So a mutual defense treaty will destroy strategic ambiguity, and it will probably, with these two trends I have described to you, if I'm right about them, I'm not saying I'm always right, but if I'm right about them, will only enhance that sense of entitlement, which can have very dangerous consequences. Yeah. The other gentleman with.
Oh,
hello. You.
Yes. You spoke about the U.S. China strategic competition, and Singapore has this unique role in being a. Is it on? Yeah. Singapore has this unique role in being favored by both, or treading carefully between both at least. Some suggest that this therefore means that Singapore should serve as an international diplomacy hub, for example, the base of a lethal autonomous weapons agency. You've got a realist opinion. Do you think Singapore's diplomatic ministry would be open to taking such a role, like an Asian Geneva here in, an Asian Geneva?
No, if we do want international organizations to anchor themselves in Singapore, and some have, right? However, that's a very different thing from playing a role. In this particular instance of China-Taiwan relations, there is no international organization or any third party that has a significant role to play. If there is a role to play, unfortunately, the man is dead. I think the late Prime Minister Abe was probably the only person who could go and tell the Taiwanese, don't go too far. We support you, we like you, we'll help you, but don't go too far. He's the only one who will tell them, and with any prospect of them listening. But he's dead, right? There is no role that I can see that any third country or any international organization can play. China and Taiwan have met in Singapore twice. But our role was to provide the tables and chairs, and serve some tea and coffee. We didn't try to play a mediating role. We just provided a relatively neutral place for them to meet. But it's those two that need to meet. And there are no mood to meet these days.
And if I could follow up briefly, if I could get your opinion then beyond Taiwan, looking at new technology challenges, such as from artificial intelligence or from sort of the new frontiers where we see a lot of international diplomacy is starting to revolve around. Do you think Singapore, with its innovative governance, and do they have more of a role to play there?
Well, we are trying to play a role in the negotiations for regimes about some of these new technologies. For example, cyber crime, cyber thing like that. But it's a long haul thing. We are only there are no rules, about the use of, say, cyber warfare. There are rules about kinetic warfare, but there are no rules about cyber warfare. And we are trying in the UN and other forums to try to develop. We are playing a role. I mean, our Perm Rep to the UN is now chairing a committee to try to put up some parameters about cybercrime. It's going to be a long, long, long haul, and we're only at the very beginning. But I won't exaggerate our role, nor will I denigrate our role. But we try where we can. But in these new domains, we are only at the very beginning, internationally, right? So how they will evolve, how any country is going to play a role is yet to be determined. We are all making it up as we go along, which is usually the case in international relations.
Thank you.
That's how it works, You can't predict what's happening. Actually, that's how most people live their lives.
While we're getting the microphone down to the next question, I have something coming in online.
Yep.
So if I may ask this question. What do you make of the discussion of multipolarity, with India and some regional or middle powers becoming more geopolitically ambitious? Do you think there are countries, especially in the global south, that might seek a strong Europe and a strong Russia, if anything, as an antidote to U.S. China competition?
Well, I don't think anybody is seeking a stronger Russia as an antidote to U.S. China competition, because Russia is now totally dependent on China. There's no other friend. But this is already a multipolar world, you know. And that's good news, because in multipolarity, there's maneuver space. Look, Asia in particular, Indo-Pacific, Japan is there. Since the 16th century, Japan has defined a large part of its identity as not being part of China. Ditto Korea, North and South. If anything, the North Koreans are even more suspicious of China than the South, and certainly more suspicious of China than they are of the United States. Okay, I've been there several times. Certainly Vietnam, certainly Korea, certainly India. So it is already a multipolar world, and that's good news for countries like Singapore, because in multipolarity, there is maneuver space. Now, imagine if there's only one pole. Then you have no agency, you have no room to maneuver. You just do as you're told. If there are two poles, you have slightly more room. But if you have many poles, in principle at least, you have a lot of room to maneuver. Now, again, whether you have the wit to recognize the opportunity and the ability, the courage, because it takes some courage sometimes, and agility to take advantage are different matters, but in principle, multipolarity is good. This is already a multipolar world.
Thank you.
That unipolar moment was very short, I told you. It's just that 20-odd years between 89 and 2008. Therefore. Yeah, sorry, somebody else?
Thank you. Over here.
Yeah.
In your book, Singapore is not an island.
Okay.
You quote Mr. Lee Kuan Yew saying that a small country is practically a joke.
No, he said in the 20th century, small island states are a political joke.
Yes. And you follow on by saying that because there's so much at stake for Singapore, that implementing unpopular policies at times is important or is necessary. And so 50 years ago, when independence was thrust upon Singapore, it seems
almost
to have...
60 years ago.
Almost 6 years ago, yes.
60 years, 57.
And would have made sense to have a mandatory service requirement for the military to protect Singapore militarily. That policy still stands.
Yes.
The question I have is, in terms of popular sovereignty, if the Singapore government has to force legally Singaporeans to fight for their country, what is Singapore, first of all, in terms of the population, is the population willing to protect Singapore in this region that has increasing conflict? And looking ahead, in terms of the relationship that the Singapore government builds with its people, given that the Singapore government prides itself on it being a newfound democratic form of government, how can the Singapore government instill that sense of protection for the country and establishing and maintaining its sovereignty if it currently has to force individuals to fight for the country?
I don't think individuals are forced to serve in the armed forces. It's part of the law. And if you don't think that's so, try to avoid it if you are Singaporean, right? If you do, stay out of Singapore, don't come back, right? But I think Singaporeans, by and large, generally accept the need to defend ourselves. They do accept the need because this is quite a dangerous region, and our neighbors now and then, remind us this is a dangerous region. Look at the new Malaysian government. What did they do? One of the first things Anwar Ibrahim has done is revived their claim to Pedra Blanca, which has been solved by the ICJ long ago. We should give him a medal. We should give Dr. Mahathir a medal, because he makes us a nation. He impresses, our neighbors impress upon most Singaporeans the need to fight. Are you Singaporean?
I am not.
That's why you don't know. See? Where are you from?
I'm American. And
that's why you are in a huge country, far away, and you don't have to worry about petty nuisances like this, right? But we have to, because they are not petty. And let me tell you something. In 1991, our neighbors, both Malaysia and Indonesia, thought it was a jolly good idea to hold a joint military exercise, a parachute drop. It wasn't very large scale, but it was in Kota Tinggi, which is quite close to Singapore. there is an unspoken rule. Of course, it's their territory, Malaysian territory, you can do what, but there's an unspoken understanding that they don't do military maneuvers too close because it just gets us nervous, and when we are nervous, we are not very pleasant people. Okay? And just in case, this happened in 1991, and the date is significant because that was just 1 year after Goh Chok Tong took over Lee Kuan Yew. Nobody doubted Lee Kuan Yew's resolve to defend Singapore, but they were testing Goh Keng Swee. What did we do? We mobilized our entire armed forces, including me. We issued live ammunition, new weapons, to our tanks, our armor, our soldiers. We moved all our armor and artillery and the bridging equipment to the jumping off points, the assembly areas, to invade Malaysia if they try anything funny. And and I forgot to mention, this exercise was held on the 8th of August, the eve of our National Day. And just in case we didn't get the message, we were too obtuse to get the message, the code name of the exercise which they publicized was called Pukul Habis, which means, finish them off, colloquially translated. So we mobilized our entire armed forces. We issued new weapons. We issued live ammunition to not just the soldiers, but to the armor, the artillery, and we moved them all to the assembly areas, the jumping off points. And we mobilized our Air Force. Combat air patrols were flying all over the place. And they have never done it again. We also surrounded the Malaysian High Commission with troops, and the railway station was still Malaysian territory with troops. And they have never done it again. So I think Singaporeans will fight. They don't have to be coerced to fight. Now, of course, I don't think Singaporeans will fight if we go around invading some other country for no good reason, right? And they shouldn't fight either, right? Yes?
Mr. Kausikan, also closer to home, I was curious your perspective on the effectiveness and relevance of ASEAN, and if there's more that can and should be done in the context of Myanmar.
Okay. First of all, the very fundamental purpose of ASEAN is to manage relations between its members. We are not a happy band of brothers singing in perfect harmony. Because if we were a happy band of brothers, we would have no need for ASEAN. It is precisely because the most difficult bilateral relationships in Southeast Asia are among ASEAN members. You need some mechanism to ensure at least a modicum of civility and stability in that relationship. Everything else we do is a bonus. But this is the fundamental purpose. That fundamental purpose we do quite well. Other things we don't do too well. And I don't think we are going to do very well for the next few years. And the reason is simple. ASEAN is an interstate organization. And we can do no more than what its members permit it to do. It is not a supranational organization. Right? And it's a fact that the domestic politics of key ASEAN countries is rather, to put it politely, complicated at the moment and not likely to get any less complicated for the foreseeable future. And so what we can do is limited. But in its fundamental purpose of managing relations, it does pretty well. And if we don't have an ASEAN, we'd have to invent something else like it in order to manage relations. You just think of, ASEAN was founded in 1967, right? Think of the state of Southeast Asia in 1967. 2 years earlier, Singapore had been politely, we call it politely separation, but expelled from Malaysia, or asked to leave, shall we say. All right? And the relationship was fraught with racial tension, and there were quite important voices in Malaysia advocating the forcible reintegration of Singapore into Malaysia. In 1967, August 1967, it was less than a year. Indonesia had stopped fighting an undeclared war against Singapore and Malaysia only less than a year earlier, called confrontation. The Philippines was still pursuing seriously a claim over a large chunk of Malaysia, to which Sabah. And there were all kinds of irredentist movements on the borders of West Malaysia and southern Thailand and southern Philippines and Indonesia. In short, we are a bloody mess, right? Now, many of these issues have not been resolved, but they have been certainly seriously attenuated. And I think ASEAN is largely, not solely responsible, but largely responsible for that. From that point of view, it has been quite successful, but there are limits. The price we pay is for having this kind of organization is decision-making by consensus. Now, Myanmar, I think ASEAN made a fundamental mistake over Myanmar. This latest thing, right? This latest coup. The fundamental mistake is this. It was not wrong to put out 5 principles of what we consider acceptable conduct. But think about it. Those principles are not implementable. Because if the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military, was really the kind of organization that would have a dialogue with its political opponents, which will forswear violence against its political opponents, that would be, kinder and gentler organization, it would not have a coup in the first place. So there was no prospect of them ever complying. It was there to set a benchmark of what we consider acceptable behavior, and that's important. But it was a mistake to go further and say the State Administration Council, which is the junta, the name the junta calls itself, cannot attend ASEAN meetings until it complies with those 5 principles, which it had never any intention or prospect of complying with. Now, if you want to influence them, it's very difficult to influence the Tatmadaw. But if you want to influence them even a teeny little bit, right, you have to talk to them. You're not going to organize an ASEAN force, invade them and overthrow them and put back Aung San Suu Kyi into power. And by the way, she's largely responsible for this mess too, She's not an angel. Huh? Just because you're a victim doesn't make you an angel. That also goes for Ukraine. Huh? Okay? So you're not going to do that, right? So how are you going to influence them? You can only do that by talking. And if you refuse to talk to them, why should they listen to you? How can you influence them? They can't read your mind, right? So it's a mistake. The most latest communique on Myanmar, which was issued just a month or so ago, less than a month ago actually, the 5 points have become 15 points. And if you read those 15 points, what it means is we realize we made a mistake, but we do not admit so. So we have confused the issues to get third parties involved like the UN. If the UN gets involved, then we can talk to the Tatmadaw. In other words, it's a nice way of climbing down the high horse we got on without thinking too clearly. Because ASEAN's policy on Myanmar is a posture, it's not a policy. And that's true of every country. I went through the earlier period, and I can see quite clearly the US, Europe, they are not interested anymore. They just do the minimum. Because everybody has now finally realized Myanmar is not important. It is certainly a humanitarian tragedy, what's happening in Myanmar. But a humanitarian tragedy is not necessarily automatically of geopolitical consequence. And Myanmar is an example of a humanitarian tragedy that is geopolitically irrelevant. That is the hard fact of where we are on Myanmar. You look shocked. No, then calm down. So don't worry about it. They will get out of it. They will get out of it. The solution now is entirely in the hands of the Tatmadaw. At some point, they will do what they said they will do. They will have some form of election, which will be neither free nor fair. Their political party will win, which will be the military in suits instead of uniforms. And then everybody will say, good, it's solved, and then we'll go back to business as normal. That is what's going to happen.
Hi. Yeah. So you mentioned briefly about the role of the United Nations. I'd like to ask a bit more about that. So a lot of mainly liberal actors in global politics have argued that the mutual legitimization of the United Nations by actors, and especially state actors, will ultimately improve the way that the power balance in the world, especially resolving and supporting issues like U.S. and China, which is so multifaceted. As someone with a more realist perspective, do you denounce that view? Do you believe it's just a sense of idealism, or do you hold some merit to the
I think
points?
it's just nonsense. The United Nations, like ASEAN, can do no more than what its members allow it to do, and in particular, it can do no more than what the 5 permanent members allow it to do. When the 5 permanent members are involved, it can do nothing. That's the hard fact. And that's not a bad thing. The veto, which the 5 permanent members have, is like a fuse in your electrical system. It prevents the whole thing from blowing up. Right? So is it better to have some United Nations than no United Nations? I think it's quite obvious some is better than nothing, unless you are a complete idealist and you want perfection. There is no perfection to be found on earth. Believe me, you will find out sooner or later. There may be perfection to be found in heaven if there is a heaven, but even there, heaven is based on hierarchy, you know. There's God, there's angels, there are archangels, there's cherubs, and so on. So I don't think there's perfection to be found either on earth or heaven. I may be wrong, but certainly not to be found in the United Nations.
Hi, Mr. Kausikan.
Yep.
Here. Hello. Mr. Kausikan.
Oh, who do you there? Oh, I saw the top one.
Hi.
Yeah.
Though the PAP remains in power, Singapore, in terms of political liberties, looks quite different today than it did 30 or 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you think this trend of political liberalization will continue, even despite this increasingly tense geopolitical situation, or do you think it will be slowed down?
Well, I think, political evolution is never in a straight line and never ever in a teleological fashion towards some predetermined goal. That is one of the fallacies of much Western political thought, that there is a certain trajectory to history, right? I think Singapore is a very different place now than when I was growing up. When I don't know how old you are, but you look much younger than me. Almost everybody is younger than me, so that's not probably a very good criteria. But it's certainly very different, all right, now than in the past. And that's because the Singapore ground has changed. As you have developed, people are better educated, people are more exposed and so on, and they want a different way of governing. And that's almost inevitable. But that's not to say that this is a single trajectory up and up and up and on. Supposing there is a war breaking out around us, I mean, we not necessarily need to get involved. A war between U.S. and China, let us say, right? I told you I don't think it's very likely, but it's not impossible. We wouldn't want to get involved, but certainly our population will take certain positions. And we'll have to keep that under control because they can tear us apart, And that cannot be done gently, by the way, right? And that's true of all countries. And we have had to do it. I don't know how long you lived in Singapore, but look, for example, when the civil war was going on in Sri Lanka, we had to come and tell some of our Tamil population, this has got nothing to do with us. You can follow it. You start giving money to the Tamil Tigers or anybody, you go to jail without a trial, by the way. Right? And we have had to do that, say, to our Sikh population when the Indira Gandhi government stormed the Golden Temple in Amritsar. And we have to do that from time to time because we are subject to all this external pull. This is a very diverse place, right, as you may have noticed. And, but a lot, and so that people are not unaffected by things that happen around us, but we have to keep it under control because they've got nothing to do with us, really, right? And we need to maintain the social cohesion. So I say that this is a trajectory we are on now, and it's driven by a different kind of population, a better educated. It's driven by the success of the PAP in developing Singapore. But if something happens in our environment, I don't guarantee that this is one single trajectory. It may be paused, it may be reversed, and then it may go on again after that. Who knows? But my point is this. There is no smooth trajectory of political development in any country, in any part of the world. That is just a myth. Right? Yeah, somebody up there. Yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned briefly that the West has been complacent in their appeal to the global South. And of course, we've seen this with the emergence of the non-aligned movement. And I wanted to ask, currently with the U.S. Africa Summit going on, and how is the increasing complexity of international relations likely to change the appeal of the West and China towards the global South?
Well, I think that Chinese foreign policy over the last 10 years, in other words, under Xi Jinping, has not been a stellar success. Because I'm hard-pressed to think of any major country, or even some not so major economies, that do not have anxieties about one aspect or another of Chinese behavior. And that's as true of Africa as anywhere else. Although it is true that China's reputation in the global south is generally better or less bad than it is in the global north. That is something for the Chinese to fix, you know, right? I think the Chinese have made 3 fundamental mistakes in their foreign policy, which apply to the global south, but perhaps to a lesser degree, right? First, I think they prematurely abandoned Deng Xiaoping's very wise policy of hiding your light and biding your time. Prematurely abandoned. Too much boasting, in short, prematurely, which just arouses people. And once you boast about your ambitions, your capabilities, people will not forget, even if you stop boasting, right? Second, I think they drank too much of their own Kool-Aid. They believed the propaganda about the West being in irrevocable and irreversible decline, absolute decline, and China's rise being up and up and on and on. And now we know that's not true. The West has got many problems, but so has China. And the Chinese problems are perhaps more fundamental than Western problems, although both are quite serious. And as Ukraine has shown, in extremists, having tried every other thing, the West will do the right thing. That's the nature of democracy. First you do every other thing, which is irrelevant, then you do the right thing. Because the right thing is usually the hard thing, and democracy is finding it hard to make hard decisions. But eventually you can get there, right? And the third mistake was this silly partnership with no forbidden areas, no limits with Russia. How is it a good thing for China? Within those 3 big mistakes, there are some lesser mistakes, mainly around the nature of Chinese investment, the terms of Chinese investment in the global south, which is not without its own problems. Which country do you come from, sir?
I come from Uganda.
Oh, Uganda, you have some problems with Chinese investment, the railway.
Yes, yes.
Right, so, you know, but you still need the investment, there's no doubt about that, right? So I don't think you should shun it. But these are problems really for China to solve, you know. It's not for the global south. I mean, in the global south, you can advise China, tell them this is a problem, that's a problem. I mean, you know the problems, and they are quite common problems throughout the global south. I haven't been to Africa for a long time, but I have been traveling before the pandemic, of course, quite a lot in Central Asia. And I hear much the same complaints. And you hear much the same complaints even in countries that are very close to China and dependent on China, like Pakistan, like Laos, like Cambodia. They are suppressed sometimes by the governments, but they exist as an undercurrent there. But that's something for the Chinese to solve, not for us to solve for them. We can't anyway. Have I answered your question, or I don't know, not quite sure. Would you like to ask something follow-up?
Yes, you've elaborated well on the implications of Chinese diplomacy.
Yeah.
But what I was wondering is how the West is likely to react, considering...
Oh, okay, yeah. No, I mean, the West is responding the way you have seen it respond. You know, I mean, after China has had these summits with Africa, right, Japan did so, and the Biden administration is rather belatedly doing so. Now, if I was African, I would think of ways how to take advantage of this, you know, right? You know, this competitive, you know, for small countries or for third world countries, let's use the old words, the global south, right? There are 2 disastrous situations. One is if, of course, the US and China go to war. Then there's no room to maneuver, you know, right? The other equally disastrous situation is if they cooperate perfectly. Then there's also no room to maneuver. So some level of competition is not a bad thing, right? And if you have your wits about you, you can try to take advantage about it. The problem with much of the global south or the third world is this. When I was traveling around Central Asia, I was constantly asked, not so much by governments, but by people, generally young people, how can we take advantage of the Belt and Road without falling into traps, debt traps or other kinds of traps? My answer was always very simple, but it was one that depressed them. Do not be corrupt. Then all will be fine. I'll give you an example of Singapore, right? When Singapore became unexpectedly independent, the dominant theory among the third world was that the multinationals are your enemy. Because they are mostly more powerful than you, they will exploit you, they will take advantage of you, and you will lose your agency and sovereignty. But because the situation was desperate and dire, I mean, unemployment in Singapore at that time was in double digits, in the teens. I think it was 15 or 16% unemployment, and the prospect was even worse. So we decided to invite the MNCs in, contrary to all third world development theories of that time, because we believe that we are sovereign, and if we respect our own laws and enforce them, their power over us is limited. Even though, absolute terms, they are richer, they are more powerful. And we were proven right. So my advice to the Central Asians, which depressed them greatly, was make sure your governments are not corrupt, you'll be fine. You can benefit without losing any agency or sovereignty. That is what depressed the young people in those countries. Many of which then came to study at the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore and didn't go home. Our gain, their loss.
Okay, I have a question, talk about the...
Where I can't see who's asking the question. Oh, all right, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The question is, you know, we're coming from the United World College, yeah?
Yeah.
So I'm the parent of the United World College. United World College have one of the campaign called it's the United Work. We are digital citizens. We are all, I mean, it's regardless which country you're coming from. So if we put the lens a little bit far away, 100 years, 1,000 years, do you think that is possible? We will not mention any country, but we are just mention we are digital citizen of the world. If not, what's your recommendation for, I mean, United World College? What is the suggestion? We want to change the slogan or the mission for future.
Look, I am very skeptical. I mean, I think digitalization, these new technologies will empower a lot of things. But I don't think it will erase national identity. There have been 3 experiments in erasing national identity. 2 are still ongoing. One was the Soviet Union, who believed that they can create a new Soviet man. And they believed it until it didn't happen. And overnight, everybody found he's Russian or Ukrainian or Belarusian or Kazakh, Uzbek, and so on, right? The other ongoing experiment is the EU, which I called, to the chagrin of some European ambassadors, the Soviet Union with human rights. Because they also believed that they could create a new European man that was not German or Spanish or Portuguese or Polish, which is a bloody myth, all right? The third ongoing experiment is China. China has 56 nationalities, right? And they boast about it. But in fact, China is a Han country, right? And their way of dealing with nationalities is to keep a few for touristic purposes and make the rest Han. And that's why they have a problem with Tibet and Uyghurs, because there are just too many of them. The other nationalities in Yunnan and all that, they are rather small numbers, so you can deal with them that way. But it's an ongoing experiment. Maybe you can make everybody Han. The southern coast of China in ancient times during the Han Dynasty was not considered Han. It was colonized and made Han, right? But there are 2 peoples at the northern part of China and the southern part that accepted a lot of Chinese culture but just refused to become Han. That's the Koreans and the Vietnamese. You look at Korean traditional political culture and Vietnamese traditional political culture, it is 100% China. Chinese political culture. In fact, Koreans are the only last remaining Confucians. In North Korea in particular, it's a Confucian society, it's not a communist society. But they just refuse to become Han. And that's why they are Koreans and Vietnamese. It's not an accident, they are also 2 of the most stubborn peoples on earth, okay? Because it's thousands of years of just refusing. So I am very skeptical it can be so, but that doesn't mean that digitalization is useless. Younger people certainly have much more in common across borders through these new technologies. But whether the state system will disappear, whether we will all become, one nice, harmonious human race and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, forgive me if I'm rather skeptical about that. What is my recommendation? It's not for me. I'll be dead long before this happens. It's for you to go and think about something to do. And on that cheery note, I shall stop. One final question, yes.
Yeah, I just had a follow-up question on Singapore's political system. So before, you were speaking about the success of the PAP, which has remained in power in Singapore for many decades. Yeah. Do you actually think that this lack of a strong opposition in Singapore might be a problem? And how do you think Singapore's political system might evolve to adapt to some of the changes that you mentioned?
Look, every election is actually 2 elections. So far, at least, I think the vast majority of Singaporeans want the PAP to be in power. At the same time, they want some opposition to keep an eye on the PAP. The question is how much opposition, and of course, accidents can happen, right? But at the same time, I think the opposition in Singapore has 2 fundamental problems, which we were talking about just now. Singapore is a small place, right? And small countries, I said, never without agency, but the fact is, policy options for small countries are only within a very narrow range, right? And that range has been occupied by the PAP, so if you're opposition, you're finding it very difficult to come up with credible alternative policies. Because in small countries, there are only a limited number of things that can work. And mostly the government has already captured those things for themselves. The other problem is that the PAP is actually a very broad church, As long as you believe in a few very fundamental things, like first, don't be corrupt, which is, even if you're corrupt, you will say, I believe in not being corrupt. Don't be corrupt. I believe in multiracial meritocracy. Then you can join the PAP. There are all kinds of political currents in the PAP. You know there are at least 4 ministers whose fathers were detained under the Internal Security Act, and they are ministers today. All right? So as long as you, and 1 minister who was convicted for leaking official secrets. Right? So as long as you believe in certain fundamental things, you can join the PAP. It's a very broad church, so they absorb quite a lot of the political talent of people. Not everybody wants to pursue a political career. It's a very thankless career in any country, and becoming more and more thankless in Singapore too, because your constituents are never going to say you did a good job, It's against the nature of constituents to say you had done a good job. Right? So these are the 2 fundamental problems, but it doesn't mean that the PAP will be in power forever. In fact, the day that the PAP thinks they'll be in power forever is the day they will begin to lose power. Right? And they don't think that way. That means they fight every election hard, they make sure the policies are the best they can. No policy is perfect, as I began by telling you, there's always some trade-off, right? But, that's the best we can. So I don't think, again, as I answered the other gentleman's question, there is no political trajectory that is smooth, up and on and on. It's always wavy at least. Things progress by meanderings and pauses, fits and starts, and there's no particular predetermined direction. It's up to you. The corollary of my emphasizing this point that everybody has agency, even the smallest country has agency, is every individual has agency. I do not believe your destiny is written in the stars. Your destiny is what you make it of yourself. And on that somewhat more cheery point, I shall really stop. Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much, Bilahari. I think one of the aims of our speaker series is always to broaden our horizons and make us think differently from people who've lived through such fascinating experiences and thinking. But can I ask you one final closing question, which is really about our students?
Yep.
Our mission as a college is for peace and a sustainable future.
Yeah.
To unite peoples, nations, and cultures, which might go against your comments around common humanity, I don't know. But I'm interested, with your background and what you've seen in the world, if we were to be saying to our students, many of whom watching and here today are global politics students and interested in that arena, what advice would you say that you've gleaned over your career and writings and thinkings that you'd want to share with them that you wish you'd known when you were their age?
Well, frankly, when I was their age, I didn't think about these things at all, right? I was more interested in chasing women and, things like that, right?
Tell us about that, yeah.
Well, that's quite natural, That's how the human race perpetuates itself, fortunately or unfortunately, right? But don't get me wrong, I mean, I think you should have these ideals, But you should pursue these ideas with, in a realistic way. Things are not going to happen just because you wish sincerely that they will happen. You have to make them happen. And to make them happen, you have to work with what you have. And what you have on this in this veil of tears we call the earth is imperfect material, imperfect information. And so partial successes, many steps forward, many steps backwards, sideways, but don't give up. Don't give up, because you may not get 100%, but even, let's say, 10% of what you set out to do is better than 0%, right? So keep trying, don't give up.
It's been fascinating to hear about all the things that have happened in the region and your thoughts on the current perspective. So, I know I speak on behalf of everybody. It's the end of a long day, but hearing you has been absolutely riveting as always. So thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
Time. Thank you very much, Bilahari Kausikan.